Welcome to Renwick Psychology Academy. In this lesson we'll explore key concepts from A-level psychology, breaking down theories, research studies and evaluations in a clear and exam-focused way. The aim is to help you understand psychology, apply it confidently and succeed in your exams. So types of conformity and explanations. So looking at ISI and NSI. So conformity refers to a change in a person's behaviour or beliefs as a result of real or imagined group pressure. And psychologists have identified different types of conformity, which vary in how deeply a person accepts the group's views. One type of conformity is compliance. This occurs when the individual publicly agrees with the group but privately disagrees. Behaviour changes, but beliefs don't. So compliance is often temporary and tends to occur when people want to gain approval or avoid rejection. Another type is internalisation. This is the deepest level of conformity. So here, an individual generally accepts the group's beliefs and attitudes as their own, and both public behaviour and private beliefs change, and this conformity is usually long-lasting. And psychologists explain conformity using two main processes: normative social influence and informational social influence. Normative social influence, or NSI, this occurs when individuals conform in order to be liked or accepted by the group. People may go along with the majority even when they know the answer is wrong, normally because they fear rejection or social disapproval, and NSI is strongly linked to compliance. Informational social influence, or ISI, this occurs when individuals conform because they are unsure and believe others are more knowledgeable. This is more likely to happen in ambiguous or difficult situations. And ISI often leads to internalisation as the individual accepts the group's information as correct. So in summary, conformity can involve superficial changes in behaviour such as compliance, or deeper changes in belief such as internalisation. These are explained by normative and informational social influence, which highlight the powerful role of social pressure in shaping human behaviour. Evaluations of types and explanations of conformity. So one strength of the explanation for conformity comes from research support for internalisation. So Scott Bokemper et al. In 2021 studied mask wearing behaviour during the COVID-19 pandemic, and they found that individuals were more likely to wear masks when they genuinely believed it was effective at reducing the spread of the virus, rather than simply to gain approval. And this suggests internalisation had occurred as behaviour change was based on acceptance of the group's beliefs, even when there was no social pressure present. There's also research support for informational social influence. Todd Lucas et al. 2006 found that people were more likely to conform when solving difficult math problems than easy ones, and this suggests that when situations are ambiguous, individuals look to others for guidance, supporting the explanation of informational social influence. However, a key counterpoint comes from Asch's research. So Asch found that conformity was greatly reduced when there was just one dissenter who gave a different answer. This suggests that conformity may decrease because social pressure is reduced, supporting normative social influence, or because an alternative source of information is provided, supporting informational social influence. This means that both interpretations are possible. Another limitation is that individual differences affect conformity. Paul McGee and Richard Teven in 1967 found that individuals with a high need for affiliation, known as N affiliates, were more likely to conform. This suggests that conformity may not only be explained by situational factors like ISI and NSI, but also by personality traits. This raises the question of whether the distinction between informational and normative social influence is always useful. For example, Lucas et al. Findings could be explained by informational social influence, normative influence, or a combination of both. However, Asch's research provides evidence that both processes can operate depending on the situation. So overall, while ISI and NSI are useful explanations for conformity, research suggests they often interact, may not always operate independently. Variables affecting conformity. So in this section, we'll look at variables that affect conformity based on Asch's research into majority influence. So we'll start with Asch's baseline procedure. Asch used a sample of 123 American male undergraduate students. They were tested in groups of between 7 and 9 people, but only one person in each group was a real participant. The rest were Confederates who had been instructed how to respond. The task was a line judgment task, and participants were shown the target line and then 3 comparison lines. They had to say out loud which comparison line matched the target line in length. The correct answer was always obvious. In the baseline condition, Confederates gave the same wrong answer on 12 out of 18 critical trials. The real participant always answered last or second to last, meaning that they had incorrect majority response before giving their own. Asch found that participants conformed on around 36.8% of the critical trials. 75% of participants conformed at least once, while 25% never conformed at all. This demonstrated the powerful effect of majority pressure, even when the task was unambiguous. Group size. So one variable Asch investigated was group size. He found a curvilinear relationship between group size and conformity. When there was only one Confederate, conformity was very low. With 2 Confederates, conformity rose slightly, but when the majority increased to 3, conformity rose sharply to around 31%. However, increasing the group size beyond 3 or 4 made very little difference. Conformity leveled off, suggesting that once a majority is large enough to exert pressure, additional members add little extra influence. Unanimity. Another important variable was unanimity. Some variations, Asch introduced a dissenter who gave a different answer to the majority. The dissenter could either give the correct answer or simply a different incorrect answer. When unanimity was broken, conformity dropped dramatically from 36.8% to around 5%, and this suggests that the presence of social support reduces conformity as it increases confidence and provides an alternative source of social information. Task difficulty. Asch also investigated task difficulty. He made the line judgment task harder by making the comparison lines more similar in length, and as task difficulty increased, conformity levels also increased. This suggests that when individuals are unsure of the correct answer, they're more likely to conform due to informational social influence, as they assume the majority is more knowledgeable than themselves. So overall, Asch's research shows that conformity is not fixed, but varies depending on situational factors such as group size, unanimity, and task difficulty. Evaluation of variables affecting conformity. So a limitation of Asch's research is that it involved an artificial situation and task. Judging the lines in a lab lacks realism, which reduces ecological validity. Susan Fisk in 2014 argued that Asch's groups were not very groupy and did not resemble the meaningful social groups people belong to in everyday life. There's also an issue with demanding characteristics. Participants may have guessed the aim of the study and altered their behaviour accordingly, either conforming because they thought it was expected or resisting to appear independent. Another limitation is limited application. Asch only used American men, and research suggests women may be more conformist in certain situations, particularly when tasks involve social judgments. So Nito in 1995 found higher conformity rates in women. Cultural bias is also an issue. Bond and Smith 1996 meta-analysis found higher conformity rates in collectivist cultures such as China and Japan compared to individualist cultures like the UK and USA. This suggests that conformity varies across cultures. However, there is research support for Asch's findings. Sonori Waijanaki and colleagues in 2020 conducted an online study using a quiz task and found that 78% of participants conformed to an incorrect majority answer, supporting the idea that conformity still occurs in modern settings. A counterpoint is that conformity is more complex than Asch suggested. Research has shown that participants who scored higher on personality traits such as conscientiousness and neuroticism were more likely to conform. This indicates that both individual differences and situational variables influence conformity. Finally, there are ethical issues to think about. Participants were deceived about the true purpose of the study and experienced potential psychological stress when they realized they had conformed against their judgment. Overall, while Asch's research provides valuable insight into conformity, its artificial nature, cultural bias, and ethical concerns limit its generalizability. Milgram's obedience study. An outline of this. So in this section, we outlined Milgram's research into obedience to authority. So Milgram aimed to investigate whether ordinary people would obey an authority figure, even if it involved harming another person. The study took place at Yale University and involved 40 male participants, aged between 20 and 50, who were recruited through newspaper adverts. Participants were told the study was about learning and memory. They were randomly assigned the role of teacher, while the learner was actually a Confederate. The teacher was instructed to give the learner an electric shock every time an incorrect answer was given, with the voltage increasing from 15 volts up to 450 volts. And if the participants hesitated, the experimenter, wearing a lab coat, used standardized verbal prods such as "please continue" or "the experiment requires that you continue." No actual shocks were given, but participants believed they were real. The findings showed that 65% of participants continued to the maximum voltage of 450 volts, despite showing signs of extreme stress. This demonstrated a high level of obedience to authority. And before the study was conducted, Milgram asked 14 psychology students to predict the results. They estimated that only around 3% of participants would administer the maximum shock, showing that obedience was far higher than expected. After the study, participants were fully debriefed and follow-up questionnaires were used to assess long-term psychological harm, and the majority reported that they were glad to have taken part. Milgram concluded that obedience is not due to personality or nationality. Instead, ordinary people are capable of obeying destructive orders when placed under pressure from a legitimate authority, meaning that German people were not uniquely different and that Americans would also obey. Milgram's variations and the findings. Milgram conducted several variations of his original obedience study to investigate which situational factors increased or decreased obedience. One important variation was the proximity variation. So in this condition, the teacher were in the same room with the learner, and obedience levels dropped from 65% in the baseline study to around 40%, suggesting that increased physical closeness to the victim reduces obedience. In an even more extreme proximity condition, the teacher was required to force the learner's hand on the electric shock plate. In this variation, obedience fell further to around 30%, demonstrating that direct contact with the victim significantly reduces obedience. Milgram also investigated location. When the study was moved from Yale University to a rundown office block, obedience dropped slightly from 47.5%. This suggests that the prestige and legitimacy of the setting increases obedience. Another key variation focused on uniform. When the experimenter was replaced by an ordinary member of the public wearing casual clothes, obedience fell dramatically to around 20%. This highlights the importance of perceived authority in influencing obedience. Milgram also tested the role of social support. When 2 additional teachers refused to continue and withdrew from the study, obedience dropped sharply to just 10%. So this shows that the dissenting role models reduced obedience by providing social support for resistance. Overall, Milgram's variations demonstrate that obedience is strongly influenced by situational factors such as proximity, location, and uniform, and also social support, rather than by individual personality traits alone. The strength of Milgram's research is that it has strong research support from later studies. So, for example, Berger replicated Milgram's procedure in 2009, but stopped the experiment at 150 volts for ethical reasons. He found that obedience levels were very similar to Milgram's original findings, suggesting that Milgram's conclusions about obedience remain valid. Further support comes from Griseb, Dolinsky and colleagues in 2003, who found that around 90% of their participants continued to at least 150 volts. This suggests that high levels of obedience are not limited to Milgram's original sample or time period. However, a major criticism of Milgram's study is that it may lack internal validity. Milgram claimed that 75% of participants believed that the electric shocks were real, but Orn and Holland argued in 1968 that participants may not have believed the setup and instead acted in a way they thought was expected of them. This raises the issue of demand characteristics. The criticism is supported by Gina Perry's 2013 analysis of Milgram's archive data, which suggested that the participants were suspicious of the procedure and doubted the authenticity of the shocks. On the other hand, research by Sheridan and King in 1972 challenges that criticism. In their study, participants believed they were delivering real electric shocks to a puppy. They found that 54% of men and 100% of women obeyed the experimenter and continued to give shocks, suggesting that obedience can occur even when the harm is real. More recent research suggested that obedience may be more complex than Milgram originally thought. Haslam and Riker in 2014 found that participants were more likely to obey the first 3 prods, but were less likely to obey the 4th, which involved a direct order. This suggests that participants were not blindly obedient, but instead made active decisions. They explained their findings using social identity theory, arguing that participants obeyed when they identified with the scientific goals of the study, rather than simply responding to authority. And finally, Milgram's study has been criticised on ethical grounds. Participants were deceived about the true nature of the study and were exposed to high levels of psychological stress. Although Milgram carried out debriefing and follow-up questionnaires, Baumrind argued in 1964 that deception of this kind can have long-term negative consequences for both participants and the reputation of psychological research. So overall, while Milgram's research has been highly influential and supported by later studies, concerns remain about its validity, ethical issues, and the simplicity of its explanation of obedience. So on this slide, we're going to look at how psychologists explain obedience. So obedience refers to following orders from an authority figure, and research suggests that situational factors play a key role in determining whether people obey. So external pressure, such as the presence of authority, social context and setting, can strongly influence behaviour. One important explanation is the agentic state theory. So according to Milgram, individuals may enter an agentic state where they see themselves as an agent carrying out the wishes of an authority figure. In this state, people shift responsibility for their actions away from themselves onto the authority. Another key concept is the legitimacy of authority. So people are more likely to obey when they believe the authority figure has the right to give orders, for example, due to their uniform, status, or institutional backing. This can lead individuals to obey even when commands involve harmful or destructive actions. So together, these explanations help us to understand why ordinary people may obey authority figures, even when doing so conflicts with their personal moral values. Situational variables affecting obedience. So first one is proximity. So one situational variable that affects obedience is proximity, which refers to how physically close the authority figure is to the participant. In Milgram's proximity variation, the experimenter left the room and gave instructions over the phone. In this condition, obedience dropped significantly, with only around 21% of participants continuing to the full 150 volts. And this suggests that when the authority figure is less physically present, their power is reduced and participants feel more able to resist orders. The lack of direct supervision makes it easier to disobey, and the pressure from the authority figure is weakened. Second one is location. Another situational variable influencing obedience is location, which refers to the setting in which the study takes place. In Milgram's original study, the experiment was conducted at Yale University, which is a well-known prestigious institution, and obedience rates were high, with 65% of participants administering the maximum voltage. However, when the study was moved to a rundown office block rather than Yale, obedience fell to around 47%. And this suggests that the perceived legitimacy of the setting increases obedience. So participants were more likely to obey when the study took place in a credible institution, as they trusted the authority and assumed the experiment was safe and important. The third factor is uniform. So uniform is a further situational variable affecting obedience, as it acts as a visual symbol of authority. In one variation, the experimenter was replaced by an ordinary member of the public wearing everyday clothes rather than a lab coat, and in this condition, obedience dropped to around 20%. So this shows that when the authority figure lacks clear symbols of authority, such as a uniform, influence is reduced. Participants were less likely to obey because the person giving the orders appeared less legitimate and powerful. So evaluation of situational variables. So one strength of the situational explanation of obedience is research support from field experiments. So in 1974, Bickman carried out a field experiment in New York City where Confederates dressed as either a guard, a milkman, or a civilian instructed pedestrians to perform tasks such as picking up litter. Participants were significantly more likely to obey the guard, demonstrating the powerful influence of uniform and perceived authority in a real-world setting. And this supports Milgram's findings and increases the ecological validity of situational variables. Further support comes from cross-cultural research. Mears and Ragemakers in 1986 replicated Milgram's study in the Netherlands using psychological harm rather than electric shocks, and they found that 90% of participants obeyed orders to deliver increasingly stressful verbal feedback to a job applicant. This suggests that situational factors such as authority and location influence obedience across cultures, not just in American samples. However, the cross-cultural validity of Milgram's finding has been questioned. So Smith and Bond in 1998 reviewed obedience studies and found that between 1968 and 1985, there are only 2 direct replications of Milgram's work. This limits the strength of the conclusions about the universality of situational explanations and suggests obedience may vary across time and context. Another limitation is the issue of demand characteristics. Gina Perry in 2013, after analysing Milgram's original transcripts, argued that many participants doubted the reality of the shocks. She reported that only around half of the participants fully believed the shocks were real. The participants were responding to perceived expectations of the experiment rather than genuine authority pressure, and this weakens the internal validity of situational explanations. Finally, the situational perspective has been criticised for being reductionist and socially dangerous. So Mandel in 1998 argued that explaining obedience purely in terms of situational factors provides an alibi for evil behaviour by removing personal responsibility. So he suggested that this perspective is offensive to survivors of events such as the Holocaust, as it downplays individual moral choice and accountability. But overall, while situational variables are strongly supported by research and help explain obedience, they may oversimplify human behaviour by ignoring individual differences and moral agency. Now we'll look at the agentic state. So the agentic state is an explanation of obedience which suggests that people see themselves as agents acting on behalf of an authority figure, rather than as individuals responsible for their own actions. So Milgram used the concept of the agentic state to explain why ordinary people were willing to obey orders that caused harm to others. So when in an agentic state, a person believes the authority figure is responsible for the consequences of their actions. In contrast, when people are in an autonomous state, they act according to their own conscience and take personal responsibility for what they do. So Milgram proposed that people shift from an autonomous state into an agentic state through what's called the agentic shift. This occurs when individuals perceive someone else as having legitimate authority and therefore feel obliged to obey them. The idea was used to explain the behaviour of Adolf Eichmann, who was tried in 1961 for war crimes committed during the Holocaust. Eichmann claimed he was just following the orders and saw himself as an agent of the Nazi state rather than personally responsible for his actions. Social hierarchies help to explain why the agentic shift occurs. Society is structured in hierarchies such as governments, the military, schools and workplaces, and from a young age people learn to obey figures of authority such as parents, teachers, police officers and judges, and this obedience becomes normalised. Milgram also identified binding factors, which are psychological mechanisms that allow individuals to minimise or ignore the moral consequences of their actions. These include denying responsibility, believing the victim deserves the outcome, or trusting that the authority figure knows best. The concept of legitimacy of authority is central to the agentic state. When the authority figure is seen as legitimate, such as a scientist, government official, or military leader, people are more likely to obey the commands. This helps to explain obedience to destructive authority, such as under leaders like Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot. And in these cases, individuals obey orders within a structured hierarchy and believe responsibility lay with those in power. So the agentic state also helps to explain real-world events such as the My Lai massacre, where American soldiers killed civilians during the Vietnam War. Many soldiers later claimed that they were following orders from superior officers. But overall, the agentic state suggests that obedience occurs not because people are evil, but because social structures and authority reduce personal responsibility for harmful actions. Evaluation of the agentic state. So there's strong research support for the agentic state explanation of obedience, particularly from Milgram study. So many participants continue to administer shocks because they believe the experimenter was responsible for the consequences of their actions. Milgram demonstrated this through the Mr. Wallace variation, where participants were more obedient when they felt the experimenter, rather than themselves, was accountable. And this supports the idea that people enter an agentic state, seeing themselves as agents carrying out orders. However, the agentic state has been criticised as a limited explanation. So Megan Berry et al. In 2024 found that obedience rates across different studies range from 0% to 100%, suggesting that situational explanations alone cannot fully account for obedience. And this indicates that individual differences and contextual factors also play an important role. A further criticism is that the obedience alibi argument proposed by David Mandel in 1998. So he argued that the agentic state can be used to excuse immoral behaviour by removing personal responsibility. Mandel used evidence from German Police Battalion 101, where officers were not forced to kill, yet still carried out atrocities, suggesting they were not simply passive agents. The concept of the agentic state links closely to legitimacy of authority, which is supporting evidence. Kilham and Mann, 1974, found that only 16% of Australian women went to the maximum voltage, whereas Mantel, 1971, found that 85% of German participants did so. This supports the idea that obedience varies across cultures depending on how authority is perceived. However, the agentic state cannot explain disobedience. In Rank and Jacobson's 1977 hospital study, 16 out of 18 nurses refused to administer an excessive dose of a drug when instructed by a doctor over the phone, remaining in an autonomous state. Finally, there's real-world application. So Rank and Jacobson's findings highlight the importance of professional responsibility and ethical training. However, Kelman and Hamilton's 1989 study argued that real-life atrocities such as the My Lai massacre are better explained by the power hierarchy within the US Army, where soldiers were under intense pressure from commanding officers. This suggests obedience is influenced by authority structures as well as the agentic state itself. Dispositional explanation of obedience. So far we've looked at situational explanations for obedience. So this section focuses on a dispositional explanation, which suggests that obedience is due to individual personality characteristics rather than the situation alone. The key dispositional explanation of obedience is the authoritarian personality. So this refers to a personality type characterized by extreme respect for authority, rigid thinking, and a strong belief in social hierarchy. People with an authoritarian personality are more likely to obey orders from authority figures, even when those orders are harmful or immoral. This concept was developed to help explain events such as Nazi Germany, where ordinary people appeared willing to obey destructive authority figures like Adolf Hitler. The theory suggests that certain personality traits made some individuals more likely to obey without question. Adorno and his colleagues proposed that the authoritarian personality develops in childhood through specific parenting styles. These parents tend to be strict, controlling and demanding, with high standards and harsh punishment for perceived failures. Children raised in this environment learn absolute loyalty to authority and rules. And according to Adorno et al., these childhood experiences create resentment and hostility towards parents, but because the child fears punishment, these feelings cannot be expressed directly. Instead, the hostility is displaced onto others who are seen as weaker or socially inferior. This explanation is rooted in a psychodynamic approach drawing on Freudian ideas about repression and displacement. As adults, individuals with an authoritarian personality show high levels of obedience to authority figures and prejudice towards outgroups, which helps explain why they may carry out harmful orders without resistance. Evaluation of the authoritarian personality. So one strength of the authoritarian personality explanation comes from research support. So Elms and Milgram, 1966, interviewed a selection of participants who'd taken part in Milgram's obedience study. They found that those who were highly obedient also scored higher on the F scale, which measures authoritarian traits. This supports the idea that personality factors such as authoritarianism can contribute to obedience. However, there is evidence that challenges this explanation. Elms and Milgram also found that many obedient participants did not display typical authoritarian characteristics. For example, they did not glorify their fathers, had not experienced unusually harsh punishment in childhood, and did not show hostility towards their mothers. This weakens the claim that authoritarian personality alone explains obedience. The explanation may also be limited because it ignores alternative psychological accounts. For example, pre-war Germany showed high levels of obedience and anti-Semitism, which may be better explained by social identity theory rather than personality. People may have scapegoated an outgroup, such as Jewish people, to strengthen their own group identity rather than acting out of authoritarian personality traits. Another limitation is that the Asch scale only measures one type of authoritarianism. It mainly focuses on right-wing authoritarianism characterized by submission to authority and traditional values. However, authoritarianism can also exist in left-wing ideologies, suggesting the scale provides an incomplete explanation. Finally, the evidence supporting the authoritarian personality has been criticized for poor methodology. Fred Greenstein, 1969, described the Asch scale as a comedy of methodological errors. One key issue is response bias, where participants may agree with statements regardless of content, inflating authoritarian scores, and this reduces the validity of conclusions drawn from the scale. Resistance to social influence. So far we've looked at why people conform and obey. This section focuses on resistance to social influence. So in other words, why some people are able to resist pressures from others. So one important factor in resisting conformity is social support. So this refers to the presence of other people who resist conforming pressures. When an individual sees someone else disagree with the majority, it reduces the pressure to conform. So the dissenter acts as a model, showing it's possible to resist the group without negative consequences. And social support is also important in resisting obedience. Milgram demonstrated this in one of his variations, when the participant was joined by another Confederate who refused to continue administering shocks. Obedience rates dropped dramatically from 65% in the baseline study to just 10%. This shows that disobedience can be socially contagious. Another explanation for resistance to social influence is locus of control. The locus of control refers to how much control a person believes they have over events in their life. People with an internal locus of control believe that what happens to them is largely the result of their own actions and decisions. In contrast, people with an external locus of control believe the outcomes are determined by luck, fate, or powerful others. Locus of control can be measured using the locus of control continuum scale, which places individuals along a spectrum from highly internal to highly external. People are not simply one or the other, but fall somewhere along the continuum. Research support suggests that individuals with a high internal locus of control are more resistant to social influence. They are more likely to resist pressure to conform or obey because they believe they are responsible for their own behaviour. They also tend to be more self-confident, achievement-oriented, and independent. And interestingly, these traits are also commonly associated with effective leadership, and this suggests that resistance to social influence may be linked to personal characteristics that support decision-making and independence rather than compliance. So overall, resistance to social influence depends on both situational factors, such as social support, and dispositional factors, such as locus of control. Evaluation of resistance to social influence. So there's real-world support for research into resistance to social influence. So one example comes from a study by Albrecht et al. In 2006, which evaluated the Teen Fresh Start program in USA. This program aimed to reduce peer pressure related to drug use and crime, and participants who received resistance skills training were better able to resist negative peer influence, suggesting that resistance can be learned and applied in real-life situations. There's also strong research support for the role of dissenting peers in resisting social influence. Gamson et al. In 1982 studied participants discussing a fictitious oil company who were planning a smear campaign. When participants were in groups and others questioned the ethics of the task, resistance rates were much higher. This supports the idea that social support increases confidence and reduces obedience. Similarly, Allen and Levine in 1971 used an Asch type conformity task. When a dissenter was present, even one who wore thick glasses and appeared unreliable, conformity fell significantly. 64% of the participants refused to conform at least once, showing that social support weakens majority pressure. There's mixed evidence for the role of locus of control and resistance. So Murphy et al. In 2021 studied attitude towards COVID-19 vaccination, found that individuals who were vaccine hesitant scored higher on internal locus of control than those who were fully accepted the vaccinations. This suggests that internal individuals who are more likely to question authority and resist pressure. However, there's contradictory evidence. It comes from Tweng et al. 2004, analysing studies conducted between 1960 and 2002. They found that people had become more resistant to obedience over time, yet also more external in their locus of control. This challenges the idea that internality always predicts resistance. Finally, the role of locus of control may be limited. Rotter himself argued in 1982 that locus of control is not fixed and depends on the situation. This suggests that resistance to social influence cannot be explained by personality alone, and the situational factors and social context also plays a crucial role. Minority influence. So in this we're going to look at Moscovici. So far we've looked at majority influence, where individuals conform to the group. However, social influence can also work the other way around, where a small group or even one individual influences the majority. This is known as minority influence. Moscovici argued that minorities influence others by creating conflict and making people rethink their views rather than simply fitting in. One key factor in minority influence is consistency. This can be split into two types: synchronic consistency, which refers to agreement between members of the minority at the same time, and diachronic consistency means that the minority maintains the same position over time. Consistency draws attention to the minority view and makes it appear confident and committed. Another important factor is commitment. Minorities are more influential when they show dedication to their cause, especially if it involves personal sacrifice. This is known as the augmentation principle, where the majority takes the minority more seriously because they appear willing to suffer for their beliefs. Flexibility is also crucial. Nemeth argued that minorities must be consistent but not rigid. If minority shows some willingness to compromise and listen to alternative viewpoints, they are seen as more reasonable, which increases their influence. Minority influence often leads to a gradual process of change known as the snowball effect. Initially, the minority view is rejected, but over time, more people begin to reconsider their position. As more individuals adopt the minority view, it gains momentum and can eventually become the majority opinion. This process explains how social change can occur, such as shifts in attitudes towards civil rights, gender equality, or environmental issues. Minority influence refers to situations where a small group or individual influences the beliefs or behaviours of a larger group. So unlike conformity, which often leads to compliance, minority influence is more likely to result in internalisation, where the people genuinely change their views. And Moscovici argued that minorities influence others through three key factors: consistency, commitment, and flexibility. So consistency refers to the minority maintaining the same message over time. Diachronic consistency means the minority is consistent across time, while synchronic consistency means all members of the minority agree with each other. And consistency draws attention to the minority view and makes it appear more credible. Commitment is shown when minorities demonstrate dedication to their position, often through personal sacrifice. This links to the augmentation principle, where people assume that if someone is willing to suffer for their views, those views must be genuinely held. Flexibility is also important. Nemeth argued that minorities must show a willingness to listen to others, adopt their position. Being too rigid can reduce influence, while flexibility increases the likelihood of being taken seriously. A minority influence leads to social change through a gradual process known as the snowball effect. As more people adopt the minority view, it gathers momentum, and it can become the adopted or accepted by the minority, by the majority. So thank you for your time and interest in our content. Enhance your studies by joining AQA Psychology Academy for in-depth learning and support. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for regular updates and access to valuable resources covering all areas of psychology.